Anyone want to guess how many young people were in prison in Norway?
50.
5?
50.
50 is a great guess, yeah, 58. So yeah, that's significantly lower, a 20th of the amount that we incarcerated. There's James Bulger case, which I'm sure most people remember in the 90s. There was an example of a small a little girl in Norway who was murdered by 2 boys around the same time, and that creates, if anyone's interested, a really nice example of how the young people who committed those acts were treated compared to in this country. We tend to think that young people should behave, should sort of be treated as children, but then in instances where they transgress, they then get laden with a full set of citizenship responsibilities. They get levelled with, like, well, you need to sort of behave like an adult now. You know, you've got this full set of adult responsibilities in instances where they're deviant. So, I think in a point that's related to that, you could say, oh, well, like, the young people in this country are just worse. They behave worse than the young people in Norway. Another way of looking at it is that we have a particular set of attitudes towards young people that are slightly different. And that means, when we're talking about how we should treat young people in society, I think it's easy to blame wider problems on the deficiencies of particular groups. And young people are a sort of classic scapegoat for some of those problems. So the jobs example that you cited about Kate Riley, where IDS had called her a job snob, where she, the young woman who said she didn't want to take a job for no money, and IDS said, oh, well, she's being a job snob. That was sort of classic Ian Duncan Smith, really, ignoring the broader structures that are in place around that individual. So one in 5 young people have a job. That's all not about young people being lazy, is it? That might be part of it, but it doesn't just stop there. With living arrangements, yeah, we've got a 20% increase in the last 15 years of young people living with their parents. That's not because they're lazy, is it? We've had a 40% increase in the cost of housing that's gone on over the same period. Cost of buying a house is astronomical now. For some young people, it's completely impossible that they would go on to buy a house, and certainly not if they're not supported by their parents. So there is some of the patterns that are highlighted reflect broader things that are happening. And I would argue that in difficult times, in an increasingly unequal society, the importance of those inequalities, and particularly as the costs are being transferred into families, things like education and housing, that the way that those patterns affect particular groups becomes important. So what you get is young people having more access to certain things where they have access to resources through their families, and then other young people who don't have those things. So internships is a really good example of that. I'm sure you'll all have noticed that the young people who are able to take up internships are those who don't need to work over the summertime, those who maybe are able to live with their parents who have a spare room. And we saw them being advertised for money a few weeks ago with some firms as well. Being able to live at home just isn't an option for some young people, but particularly in families where there's lower income groups. We also now have policies such as the bedroom tax saying, well, you're not allowed to have a spare room for your family member, your young person, to leave and then come back. So I think there's a preoccupation with a particular image of young people that is a middle class, middle England experience. You saw this with David Cameron's recent statement on welfare, where he said some people, a couple save up whilst living with their parents, whilst some people just want more independence. And when I heard that, I just thought it just was completely ignorant about the fact that not everyone grows up in families where their parents can afford to feed and shelter them well into their 20s. And I think we silence the experiences. So sometimes when you say, oh yeah, we're infantilising young people, we silence the experiences of those who don't have the opportunities to take advantage of some of the benefits that families and with more money can bring to young people, such as particularly university. So with the young people that I have worked with and done my research with, they're sort of classed as vulnerable young people. They actually, they want to live independently, yes, but also they needed to live independently just to be okay in a lot of circumstances. So their parents didn't have money to keep them at home. Some of them were from fractured family units, they'd moved around a lot. In some cases there'd been sexual and physical abuse at home, which wasn't necessarily, the authorities weren't necessarily aware of. But the young people were taking steps to make their lives better. And I think what I hope really comes out from the research, because it certainly came out when they told their stories to me, is that they were considered and careful, and they thought about the other people in their families, and they were often caring for people in their families. I don't think that side of young people comes across when you sort of when you say that we are infantilising them. I think that can be lost a bit. So I've got some stories, but I think I haven't got time to say them, the case studies. Maybe we can come back to them later. So I think there is a preoccupation with the sorts of young people that are destined to go to university or own houses, and that we should be careful about that, because I think that can further silence the stories of young people at the sharp end of a society where family really matters actually, and where you come from really matters. Income really matters, and the income of your family really matters, and that's becoming increasingly important in this age of financial austerity that we're in. So in summary, yes, I think childhood is being extended and has been throughout the past, well, certainly in the last 200 years. I think in some respects, no, young people aren't being infantilised, and they're able to, and they want to take responsibility. And I think that when we transfer responsibility for particular problems onto young people, we remove some of the responsibility from society and from the state in particular to respond to that, and I think that's quite dangerous. So I think we should take a more nuanced view that looks at different experiences of growing up, and that if we do that, it will help those young people who have more precarious lives and more difficult ones.
Thank you.
I think there's going to be some continuities here between my talk and the case study. So what I'd like to do for the next 10 minutes, I suppose, is explore this sort of idea of growing up a little bit, and do so by sharing some of the understandings I've developed through my PhD research and my experiences of youth work practice. And I'm particularly interested in unpicking this idea of a sort of perceived crisis in transition for working class youths, which is something that's come out of your talk a little bit there and was in the blurb as well for today's session. But before I get started with this, I just want to briefly sort of describe the research in order to contextualise this a little bit. So my PhD, which I'm currently in the latter phases of writing up, is interested in the lived experiences of youth workers and young people in two economically diverse and economically disadvantaged and ethnically diverse areas of the post-industrial northern city. And it's an ethnographic project, so it's involved 3 years of sort of immersive research where I've been volunteering as a youth worker, collecting interviews, focus groups, analysing documents, doing sort of classic mixed method ethnographic approach. And within this, I've been working in 3 locations in particular, 1 community homework club and 2 youth clubs. And these clubs have been diverse in their demographics, but were mostly attended by British Somali youths. So certainly my reflections on this work sort of articulate the experiences of a fairly small sample of about 15 young men that I've been working with between the ages of about 11 and 18, and the youth workers that engaged with them. And I think the youth services present a particularly interesting platform to sort of explore this idea of transitioning to adulthood, because it's here that you find a lot of young people spending time and sort of managing this transition, but you also meet professionals who have got histories of working with young people and sort of helping them through this transitional period. So the way that I'd like to contribute to this discussion today is by sharing a couple of the challenges that I think are facing youth workers that are helping sort of hard to reach young people manage this transition into adulthood. And I want to do this because I think it tells us something about some of the wider economic and political factors that are shaping the experiences of young people today. So, when I was invited to come and talk at this session, I had a look at the write-up and the recommended readings. And I went to my Wednesday night youth club where I still volunteer. And I ended up having a chat with one of the older youth workers there about the theme of growing up and transition. And something that struck me as interesting was that one of the first things he talked about was rites of passage. And this mirrored one of the comments in the article from The Independent, one of the articles that was recommended for reading for this session. And what he was saying was that one of the differences for him, working with young people now, compared to working with young people in the 80s and the 90s, was a sort of increased ambiguity around rites of passage. Now this is the idea that there are different phases in the life course that mark the transition, through adolescence and into adulthood. And he cited financial independence, getting the first full-time job, getting your own place, getting married, raising a family as sort of key examples of this. And what he was suggesting was that for the young people that he works with today, that he engages with today, those sort of stages in the life course aren't as attainable perhaps as they may have been in previous sort of times. And certainly the young people that are engaging in the youth services don't feel like those options are as available to them. There's a kind of degradation of that structure, or at least a perceived degradation of that structure, and that had a profound impact on the young people that are engaging in the youth services. So he related this to an absence of legitimate and sort of desirable opportunities, really, particularly economic opportunities. And that leads me to my first problem, really, facing the youth workers managing or helping young people to manage this transition into adulthood, in the lack of desirable opportunities for young people outside of the sort of traditional routes through higher education. And actually, a dominant theme within the comments of the young people was the amount of pressure they felt from family members, but also from schools, to achieve grades and to go through these higher education routes. And interestingly, what this intersection of pressures did from the home, from the school, was it left those young people that weren't particularly academic or felt like they'd been priced out of university, not only feeling a bit inadequate, but also feeling like there weren't any other sort of legitimate opportunities besides fairly menial sort of factory or call centre based work. And I've also recently been discussing these sorts of ideas with undergraduates at the university as a part of a different project. And I've been asking undergraduates why they came to university. And the majority of respondents, apart from a sort of hardcore few, often said that they came to university because they didn't know what else to do. Because the only information they had at A-levels was about going to university. So there is a real absence of information being communicated to young people about sort of desirable alternatives. And I think we can understand this as connected to wider factors like national industrial decline, economic crisis, and perhaps the information about wider information society. Importantly, what this translates to for the young people that I've been working with is a real sense of pessimism about their prospects, about their futures, and a sort of political and occupational apathy, which I don't think was reflective of any intentional postponing of independence, but was much more reflective of sort of fairly pragmatic understandings of inequality and of their relatively powerless positioning within an increasingly limited and competitive labour market. But these understandings that were reflected by the young people didn't mean that growing up and the sort of symbolic markers associated with that, like financial independence, for example, or the ability to successfully engage in the consumer economy, for example, were any less important. So I think one of the second challenges facing the youth workers engaging with some of these young people that haven't sort of have opted out of the traditional higher education route is managing behaviours of this group of young people who is seeking the sort of affirmation of adult status in the absence of perceived sort of desirable and legitimate opportunities. And one of the things that the youth workers recognised in this research was that young people were constructing their own rites of passage and their own opportunities for a sense of sort of adult affirmation. And this was often based around notions of respect, which encompassed a sort of expressive masculinity which could be compounded by sort of risk behaviours, by engaging in sort of deviant behaviours, not always, but could be. So, whilst we could argue that these young people might be perceived to be postponing maturity and adulthood through not necessarily engaging in these sort of traditional routes, you could also suggest that they're creating their own alternatives in the perceived absence of opportunity. The other thing that we need to recognise is what counts as maturity is sort of variable and culturally specific. So a lot of these young people may not have been engaging in full-time jobs, but they may have been looking after extended families and doing a lot of sort of other caring roles. But importantly, of course, we need to recognise that these alternatives that some of these young people are constructing for themselves are often counterproductive, because what they do is they confirm the already sort of racialised discourses which place minority youth within a sort of nexus of risk. And political risk discourses around these promote cultures of surveillance and policing within communities, which my young respondents sort of incidentally recognised and cited as evidence for their centralised positioning within a labelling process that drew on the intersection of race, gender and class and bore sort of assumptions about irresponsibility, adolescence, sort of not being adult or responsible, basically. So, adding to that, the capacity of the youth services to support these young people through this transitional period is also limited by the wider economic context, not just in the absence of positions to signpost young people towards, but also in funding cuts and the homogenisation of the services through increasingly targeted funding agendas. So I don't think that these young people are necessarily being infantilised. If anything, I think the support that's available is pivotal, but it's also handicapped by these wider sort of economic factors. So in terms of pulling these ideas into a couple of conclusive discussion points, there's three things that I want to say really. The first one is that I think if we're going to engage in discussions about growing up, then these discussions need to look beyond the experiences of middle-class university goers in a way that recognises the challenges facing marginalised communities. Secondly, I think within that, we need to communicate the varied levels of support that are needed for different groups that have different opportunities for independence. But lastly, I don't think that this recognition of difference should stand in the way of our capacity to talk about broader continuities of experience that might cut across some of these sort of social divisions, like the economic and the political factors.
Thank you. And lastly, Claire.
I broadly agree with the premise of this discussion that rites of passage have been eroded over recent years and that young people are being mollycoddled and infantilised. I actually disagree, I think, with my fellow speakers in the sense of the distinction they've made about suggesting that debate is only in relation to students and not everyone else. I think it's across the board. I actually think, to be honest with you, students have often and always been mollycoddled. That may be less of a surprise than the fact that working class youth, who actually had a far sort of stronger tradition of standing on their own 2 feet, are actually at the moment behaving more like students, as it were. And therefore we might say that one of the interesting things that's happened is that regardless of people's socio-economic situation, that there is a kind of sense of helplessness and dependence that's a bit nerve-wracking. So that's the sort of broad point. But I actually wanted to look at the issue the other way round, because I think that there's a seemingly contradictory trend to the one of kind of saying that young people are kind of hapless and hopeless, which is a tendency to actually treat even the youngest children in society as though they're adults, rather than that anyone's infantilised. It seems to me that children now are given endless rights and responsibilities, and it's paradox and an opposite side of the same coin, I think, that helps throw some light on the issue. And just one of the things I'd ask you to consider in all this, that what's really going on here is the deauthorising of adults in this process, that the focus is on young people, but what's really happening is that the people who are losing a sort of sense of themselves are the grown-ups. And maybe because I'm not young, I'm as worried about them as anyone else. Increasingly, young people are being asked to give an input into the grown-up political world of policy. There's a broader cultural trend that was started by New Labour, but which interestingly has been carried on by the Coalition and more so, of involving young people in decision-making and handing over to them huge amounts of authority from above. So David Cameron, when he launched Big Society, talked of getting the young to lead initiatives and promised to, quote, put more power into the hands of young people. And that, as you'll know, there's endless youth parliaments, shadow youth councils, youth consultation projects, youth advisors, one of whom recently came a cropper, as in Paris Brown, the crime youth consultant who ended up, rather than advising the police, getting into trouble with the police. But nonetheless, the fact that you have these police commissioners and they immediately set up a youth advisor at the same time is telling. And Cameron himself said, a crucial step in recognising the important part that children and young people must play in the formation of policy. We are making a crucial step in making sure that children and young people must play in the formation of policy, and we ignore their views at our peril. We ignore their views at our peril. It doesn't sound as though young people are being kept out of the system. So you've got all sorts of examples of this, such as Pupils Voice, where it's now a statutory obligation on schools that young people should be consulted in schools. And for example, schools councils have been invited to, quote, draw up the criteria for what makes a good teacher. The teaching unions have complained about the fact that it's increasingly commonplace to invite groups of pupils to sit in on interview panels of new staff and to allow groups of pupils to stand at the back of classes observing lessons, even without the teacher's agreement. And Ofsted have incorporated pupil voice into the inspection framework to create, quote, a genuine dialogue with pupils about what happens in the classroom. Pupils are now involved in school governing bodies. They'll be involved in developing behaviour strategies for their peers. They're acting, on Women's Act this morning, they're acting as anti-bullying advisors, and primary school pupils are being sent on counselling courses, not because they need counselling, so that they can counsel bullied children. So, they're being treated like grown-ups. The Department of Education website, even under Go, has a heading, what can teachers learn from listening to their pupils? Unfortunately, the answers inevitably begin that the pupils preferred lessons that were less teacher-led, which is hardly surprising. But it's not just schools. The Department of Health only last month came under attack from the Children's Commissioner because health bodies throughout the country are being told that they have to involve children and young people in strategic decision-making. And the Children's Commissioner, Maggie Atkinson, is concerned that this is only concentrated on involving young people in making decisions about the well-being of young people. And her argument is that children and young people, quote, need to be included in health servicing commissioning and other vital decision-making about NHS provision. Now, no disrespect to the young in the room, but I do feel as though the lunatics have taken over the asylum, and if we thought mid-staff were bad, get the primary school teachers involved in commissioning, and we're all going to go for a burden. But the fact that they're actually having this conversation seriously in the middle of a crisis about the NHS, about how you can involve pupils, is a peculiar moment. And if we say that everyone's being infantilised, why are we asking them to help us run the health service? I think that the arguments around the pupil voice are also telling, because what it actually says is that this is a way of making young people feel good about themselves. Professor Michael Fielding at the Institute of Education says it means that being listened to and taken seriously creates a positive sense of self, encourages self-belief, and gives them confidence. And there's all sorts of quotes like that. But I think that we have to be nervous when we're told that we have to listen as adults to young people's views, regardless. And I think that we have to ask what happens if those views are ill-informed or wrong-headed or untutored, And are we actually seriously saying that we should abdicate responsibility as adults and hand it over to the youth? I think that the consequence of this is where I kind of catch up with the rest of the discussion. I think that without the meaningful rituals where you socialise into being an adult, by which you basically say, no, you are not going to help decide as a 12-year-old who gets the job in the school because you're a child and you don't know anything. If you're going to be in a situation where you effectively abolish the line between adult leadership and children's decision-making, then I think that you can actually create unrealistic expectations in the young about what it takes to be an adult. And I think that's what the problem of the rites of passage discussion is. I mean, there are all sorts of things that you need to learn when you grow up. You need to learn effectively as a young person that you are not yet up to the task of being an adult. You have to realise that you are actually haven't got a clue and that you've got something to learn. And you constantly have to be at least given some adult model of what it might be that you aspire to. And if the adults are handing you the power all the time, there's nothing for you to aspire to. But it's also the case that if you imagine that it's quite easy to take responsibility as an adult if you're a young person with very little effort, then you can see that that can actually devalue adulthood. Because I think if all it takes to be an adult is that you get appointed to some advisory body, then you're just going to think this is easy peasy. If all that it takes to be an adult is to be asked what should happen, if that kind of consultation, which is fairly meaningless, then you're really going to think this adulthood stuff is just kid stuff. I mean, I bet Kate Riley, the kind of, are you staring at me? Yeah. I bet Kate Riley, sorry, I realised that glare wasn't a friendly one. I bet that Kate Riley, who complained about Poundland, for me the problem with her was that you could just imagine that she was on a kind of school council at 12. That, it's not so much that she didn't want to work in Poundland as that she couldn't understand why she couldn't work in a museum. When she got up, there was a sense of expectation that was completely unrealistic. And that she imagined, or that there is an imagination, that being an adult, achieving adult ends, takes very little effort at all. Finally, I think not only is there a sense not only is that a problem, but I think that we are in danger of turning young people into being very dull people as well, if we put too much responsibility on them. There is a trend at the moment that every young person under the age of 14 or 15 knows better than every adult, but not in a way that was kind of the rebellious, angry young man in the title of this talk. If you have a cigarette in front of a 12-year-old, they're going to tut you. If you sit and eat a fried breakfast in front of a primary school teacher, you're going to get a lecture about fatty foods. If you don't recycle, you're likely to have some kind of kids who are actually trained in green monitoring in primary schools now to go around turning the switches off and to tell you the problems of recycling. There's a kind of contempt for adulthood, and we've got these kind of children who've been turned into mini adults who lecture and hector naughty parents and naughty adults. And I just think that has to be the kind of dullest conception of a young generation ever. And I think it's mirrored in the jilted generation argument that actually Kate, I think, referred to, which is this idea that there's all these young people saying, woe is me, I'm 21, and what's going to happen to me? I'm not going to be able to have a pension, I can't buy a house, I can't settle down. You just think, what kind of imagination have you got? Why would you want that? They're all kind of like middle-aged before their time. And even worse, they then blame the baby boomers of the 60s and say the problem with you 60s generation baby boomers is that you went out and got stoned out your head all the time, had a great time, spent loads of money, enjoyed yourself. You irresponsible grown-ups. Why couldn't you have thought of us? And you just think this is not the way that we want the young people to be. So I would actually suggest that what we want to encourage is irresponsible childishness amongst those who are young. I mean, infantilising might be a problem, but actually there is a stage at which you should be young, enjoy it, and be absolutely not give a damn about the consequences. And through the process of that, you might realise that at some point you're going to need to grow up. And then when you grow up, you can be a grown-up. But if you act like a grown-up too young, then actually you're going to be a very, very dull, proper grown-up.
So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions quickly before we go out. And if we just get some quick early thoughts, if there's something you desperately want to pick up on from one of the other speeches, then feel free to ignore my question and just go for that instead. But I was thinking to Kate and Will that there was perhaps a theme in both of your speeches about I think Will put it quite nicely, there's a pessimism about the future, and so there's a pragmatic apathy on behalf of young people. And I was wondering we may well say this apathy is probably not desirable, but is there something different now about that kind of apathy to how there might have been anywhere 20 to 70 years ago? Is there something different about how that apathy plays out now? Is it more a passive, apathetic response rather than trying to get involved in changing those things positively? And then to Claire, I think I'd like to hear more about what you're saying with regards to this abdication and loss of authority on the part of adults. And I was wondering whether there's a sceptical argument to be made there, whether these getting kids involved in the curriculum and these kind of things, is that just a cover so that cuts can go on and kids can be sort of pushed out of the tent, as it were, or is it genuine on the response on the part of adults that have lost of authority, so they're having to? So I'd like to hear just a little bit more from that. So in the order in which you speak, just want to give us some thoughts on that.
Okay, so you're saying, are young people more passive now than they used to be? I think that there is some evidence of some sort of disconnection. So young people are a lot less, the attitude surveys that are done, young people are a lot less likely to feel that there should be a strong welfare system than older people. They're a lot less likely to believe in sort of universal services like the NHS and think that they should contribute to them. But that reflects an overall decline, doesn't it, that's going on. So when Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, which we've all been reminded of lately, that was something that a sort of message that was given over to the whole of society through for decades. And so I think when you level it at young people and say, oh, look at young people not caring about anything, I think that's just really a concern with adulthood, actually, and the fact that adults might be a little bit more disconnected. But having said that, I think a lot of the young people that I have worked with, and certainly I've met in my research, are really determined. They're not. They are resolute about sort of holding themselves together, impressive, and in some cases holding their family together. And I think it does an injustice to many young people when you say that they're passive or not really caring about anything. They might not be out there on the streets, campaigning for the extension of the welfare state, but who is? And I think they're sort of, a lot of the young people that I think I work with and spoken to are concentrating on keeping it together, really, and they're doing a good job of it. So I think I wouldn't say they're all passive.
Yeah, thanks. I want to make this a discussion between us, so I'll move straight on to Will.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for young people 20 years ago because I wasn't working with them, but one of the things that did come out of the conversation that I referenced in my quick talk with this older youth worker last Wednesday was that he was saying that one of the things that characterised the youth work relationship in the 80s was politicising young people, and he felt that there was more support for that and that they were more able to do that because young people did seem to engage with sort of politics. And today, what I've observed with young people that I've worked with is a sort of political apathy. Young people don't seem to be that interested. But importantly, I don't think this is about ignorance. It's not because they don't know. It's because they have an awareness of politics, but then feel like there's nowhere for them to go with that. So for me, that sort of explains or sort of articulates the experience of these young people. And I suppose a counterpoint to my own point, I suppose, the example is the fact that we do see, in the example of civil rights, for example, young people doing something that is political. It's inarticulate politics. It's not directed towards something in particular, but it is, a statement. So it depends on who you're talking about and the conversation that you're having, I think, and it's all very contextual. So if you sit down and talk to young people and to a young person in a focus group, for example, about politics, it's likely that you're not going to get an awful lot. If you're working with young people that I've been working with, but in a different context, you can see social action which does reflect a sort of dissatisfaction with wider sort of political issues.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And then Claire.
Well, I just wanted to, I'll answer your question. I thought though that it was interesting, Kate, you sort of assumed that if you were going to politicise young people, you'd kind of get them to campaign for the extension of the welfare state. I mean, what I do is I'd encourage them to want to get rid of whole swathes of the welfare state that treat them like idiots, and that actually, I don't know what happened to, I mean, it's a sign of the times that suddenly youth work is seen as a great progressive force. I mean, in my day, it was seen as the great policing force that stopped young people getting involved in politics, to be honest, by providing them with table tennis rather than batons or But I mean, we weren't walking around going, you must go down your youth centre so you get politicised. I mean, is this the kind of failure of imagination that we imagine the welfare state, or that somehow the state has got anything to do with it? It's got absolutely nothing to do with it, other than that actually it can be a drag on the morale of young people, as the only thing that anyone can imagine that could provide young people with the basis on which they could act autonomously. But obviously if you're depending on welfare, you're not acting autonomously. That's the whole problem with it. I think also that the point about the riots is maybe where I'd go with your question to me about deauthorisation, because the riots to me were shocking, gross and scary, because it indicated that the opposite of politics, the death of politics, almost that. Young people would trash their own areas, steal things. I mean, it was everything that bore no relationship to political action as has ever been understood historically, other than that it was a riot. And a lot has been written and said about that. But what I'd say is that an awful lot of older people wanted to read into it something more than was there. And I think that when you ask me about the deauthorisation, I mean, you'll often find in my experience that people will say, look, we've got an active youth council here, so young people aren't apathetic. Look, they're all organising and they're all active and they're all out there and they're doing this and they're doing that. And so it's almost like a kind of consolation prize for the adults. But there can be a kind of puppeteering aspect to that, if you want, and kind of like a kind of look at them. I was really taken with that when the FE, I can't remember what it's called, I was just trying to remember, the fund that was given to FE students, the grant, EMA. When EMA was abolished, I mean, EMA is a relatively recent phenomenon, and young people did used to go to further education colleges for many years without the EMA. They managed to organise themselves. And by the way, this is not because we're now in a recession and in the old days everyone had lots of money, as though somehow everyone's forgotten that there's been recessions in the past. I mean, in the middle of Thatcher's recession, people didn't have any MA, and loads of young people went to further education colleges. That's when I was teaching in FE. And the EMA, in a way, when people said, we've got to get rid of the EMA, when the EMA was abolished, then people sort of said, how will all these people go to college now? As though that's the only, they had to be kind of bought into going to college. They were incapable of kind of finding their way there unless the state handed them some money. But then what happened was that the anti-EMA protests were actually organised by FE lecturers who actually organised their classes to go down on demonstrations and encourage them to go. So what was fascinating about going on some of those demonstrations was seeing old colleagues of mine from NAPFI who were saying, isn't it marvellous, all these young people are out here demonstrating? And I just thought, basically my generation has abdicated responsibility for any political action and kind of wants young people to do it, or kind of hands them the power to do it. That is not the same as young people taking control of their lives. It's the absolute opposite, in fact, it's the killer.
Okay, thanks, Claire. So please, if you have some hands, and then I'll take them in groups, and then we'll get the panel to respond to them. So, yes, the gentleman there.
Can I start by making two factual observations and then make a more general point? The population of Norway is about 6 million. So if the figures that you quoted are right, they lock up far more people than we do. The idea that Scandinavia is a lovely place where they do everything nicely should have been shot by Anders Breivik. Secondly, the proposition that Victorian children were hard done by compared to ours is also misleading. There's always been a cycle in history between the idea of children as a blank sheet who have to be protected and the idea that they're young people who have to grow up in an adult world and take on as much as they possibly can. And that cycle goes on pretty much regardless of economic situations and everything else. It just depends which slice of history you take. In general, I think the problem that no one's really mentioned, which is my own analysis of the situation, is that it isn't children who are infantilised at the moment, it's people. The dumbing down of the news is, if you like, the obvious bit of evidence to go for. It seems to me that we live in a society where we don't really have a genuine democracy anymore. What we have is a paternalistic oligarchy of people who have power and who have the resources to retain power, who function rather like a social priesthood, if anything. At the moment, they happen to have all been to the same school.
But been to Oxford as well.
But what happens is this very small group of very highly educated people believe, and the ones who work for the BBC and the rest of the media believe, that ordinary people can't cope with having too much information or too complex a thing. You get people saying things like there's been a flood in Prague and the main river there, which is no longer allowed a name, has overflowed its banks. There's a steady reduction in the kind of information that people feel that other adults can cope with. So the infantilisation has happened to everyone in society, not just the children. And what we need to do is redress the balance by taking power back and restoring a genuine democracy in which everyone grows up believing that they have a right to their own opinions and their own economic decencies. And we have a fairer economic society that's based on the idea that everybody has to pull their own weight. We should stop allowing the little rich group of school kids to govern our society for us.
Thanks. Was there any other hands?
Can you tell me how that's going to happen, if you don't mind me saying so? How are people going to get back this democratic? You know, how is it? Because the media basically it's not just the government with the elite that's governing at the minute that's infantilising us, it's the media as well. How are you going to wake people up? How are you going to motivate people, mobilise people? Because it isn't happening. Because we like all the goodies. We like it. We like being asleep. Waking up is bloody hard.
It's a big problem, and this organisation is perhaps doing something about that.
And was there someone at the back?
Yeah. Something that I thought was quite interesting is this idea that sort of people are becoming adults at a later age. I think is kind of, it's not we're infantilising people. It is that sort of the actual age at which you are an adult has changed. And I was talking to one of my friends, and I said that I recently moved to a terraced house, and then I moved back in with my parents. And the age at which it's embarrassing to live with your parents has gradually got older and older and older. The age at which saying you don't have a job and you're still looking, the amount of time you're allowed has got longer and longer. So I don't actually think. So I'm 22 at the moment, and I've got this kind of bizarre situation where I've still got quite a while until I need to have everything sorted, and I think that's quite weird. The things that I miss the days when I was sort of 10 and I thought by this age I'd have everything sorted out and it'd all be normal and I'd have like a nice job, a nice house, a nice whatever and whatever. I was wondering, how much do you think that is a part of it? Do you think that actually people my age should have stuff sorted? Is it my fault, or is it, as Claire won't like me for saying this, the 60s generation and everyone who's over my age, everyone?
Thanks. Is there any other hands? Yeah, at the front.
I've got a query about the whole idea of putting young people and children or involving them as part of the decision-making process. And what is the inherent problem with hearing what they have to say, as opposed to necessarily taking direction from them? And whether, is it the case that young people at the moment are being given a voice but don't actually have any directive kind of qualities in the decision-making process? It's more just a kind of a token piece.
Okay, I'll get some feedback from our panel on this, and then we'll come back out. We've still got time, so we'll come back out after this. But Will, do you want to pick up any of that?
Just in relation to that last point, about how much influence the young people who are given a voice actually have. They're not this sort of piecemeal thing. I think from my experience of working with young people, I largely agree with that. Particularly within the youth service, which I'll keep coming back to because that's the example I have. That's really, really emphasised, and it's often part of funding agendas as well, to involve and empower young people. But the reality of the situation is that, young people's voices are, young people are able to sort of, to ask for things and to suggest things, but the decisions boil down to the sort of funding that's available and, the forum organisers at the end of the day, people that run the sessions. And I think that sort of feeds into this apathy that I was talking about, because young people are aware of that, and they end up going, well, solid, what's the point? Particularly in the sort of disadvantaged communities that I've been working in, where there isn't a lot of money to go around. So that creates a problem in itself, because you get young people sort of eventually, in the worst case, disengaging from services because they're kind of sick of being asked and not seeing those things matching up.
Thank you. Thanks. Claire, and then I'll go to you, Claire.
I just on that latter point, I mean, undoubtedly some of this stuff is cynical, but what I'm worried about is the philosophy behind it. That's the point. Is that why is it that people in authority want to listen to young people all the time? If you think it's because they think that young people are interesting, we've got a crisis, because we've got two things wrong, right? If people who actually know a lot think that the most interesting people in the world are young, then you think, what is wrong with you? Because by the very nature of the thing, the young can't possibly have all the wisdom that other people will have, right? So it's often done in bad faith and for cynical reasons. But it's also, I think there is a kind of collapse of, someone was mentioning about the media. I think it's politicians and media. I think, generally speaking, the people who run the society, my problem is not that they went to Eton, but that they actually don't believe that the rest of us could cope with, or everybody could cope with the kind of ideas that float around Eton. The thing is that they themselves, however, end up in a situation whereby they haven't got the confidence to try and convince us of those ideas. They actually genuinely have abandoned the belief in the kind of philosophies. I mean, I even wish we had a right-wing government that believed it, read any Hayek, you know what I mean? I've read some of this stuff, that had some philosophy that I could argue with, rather than simply kind of filling the space with telling us how interesting we are. And it gets kind of worse if you go down the chain. But the broader questions that have been asked, I think, what I'm really worried about is everything being determined by the economy, because it just isn't. Some of these things are bigger cultural shifts. I mean, I don't think that everything happens because of lack of money. I don't think everyone is trying to rip us off. I think we're in a serious, genuine cultural crisis, whereby you have, and this is not David Cameron's fault, and not Margaret Thatcher's fault, and we're going to have to take responsibility for ourselves, where teachers haven't got the confidence to transmit a body of knowledge to younger generations and stand there and say, well, what do we know? They're all on the internet and they're all digital natives. So we don't want to appear to be the sage on the stage, we'll all be the guide on the side, to use the terminology. And that the whole of educational theory now is about how young people are more ahead in the knowledge stakes than teachers. And that's coming out of all of the teacher training colleges. I mean, what? Right? And so where you've got a situation where you have adults who haven't got the confidence to say, we know more and we'll hand it over to you. And we'll hand it over to you because we think you're up to it. And then young people say, that's far too boring and hard, I don't want to do that. That you look them in the eye and say, I know it's boring and hard, it's not very exciting, but it's worth it in the end, you've got to listen to me. Instead they say, oh God, they say it's boring and it's hard, how can we jazz it up? And then we say, well, let's get the student council to tell us how we can jazz it up, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's what world we live in. That is much more of a problem for us than even the recession in my head.
But
Right.
can I just say, a lot of that is going on in the classroom, because I worked in FE and I was a lecturer in FE, is constrained by the targets that are now being set and by the whole business of not encouraging young people to think. That is what's going on in the classroom. You've got to tick that box. And a lot of that was to do with the shift in the curriculum in the 1980s, when actually education had got to serve the needs of the economy. And that was Mrs. Thatcher's words.
Yeah.
Once you've got that,
But it
you're
isn't
in trouble.
It is also
Because
true
you've
the
got
whole of the educational
Yeah.
establishment, no disrespect, the whole of the
Right.
educational establishment, I mean, when I say educational establishment, I agree with you, I get that, I know that is true. What I'm saying is, where have we seen, never mind sending your FE students out to riot around the EMA,
Yeah.
why haven't we seen everybody who's involved in education going out on the streets and arguing in defence of knowledge for its own sake?
But
Why has
because-
that not happened,
because
right?
it-
The whole of academia has sat by and let it happen. It's got nothing to do with Mrs. Thatcher, the economy. That's to do with the fact that grown-ups gave up the ghost. And all I'm saying is that that is going to have an impact on young generations. It's now up to young generations, by the way, to not go, oh, well, the grown-ups gave up, what can we do? Because, you know, grow up. It's, you know, then you've got to go, if that's no good, then make it better, right? You're not a kind of passive consumer of a previous generation's rubbish politics. Or even, you can't even say in terms of the economy, oh, well, look, the economy's in a mess, what can we do? Because that assumes that the economy is static and that you can't have a creative, productive impact on making it change. Grow, be different, become an engineer, do something exciting.
I will come back at you if you want to say something, but first we'll get Kate's thoughts on
I've got to do Norway, haven't I? So, yeah, the population point is obviously a really good one. And was overlooked by me. But the Bulger example and the contrast between what happens does show you that young people are treated really differently when they're naughty. So even though the population is much lower and that point doesn't stand, the treatment of young people and attitudes towards transgression is really different there. So in those institutions, there's a welfare ethos which bit has sort of gone really. What we have is a sort of a conditional welfare that you can behave like a child and have a sort of experience of childhood unless you are naughty, in which case you get a full set of responsibilities. And they don't do that in Norway. So they refer, the kids that killed Silja were small children, and they call it the accident in Norway. They call it the accident, they don't call it a murder, they don't call it a killing. They got new names, new identities, and it was a completely different story to here, where the young people were campaigning for them to be hanged and the death penalty brought back, and they were 10 and 11, those boys. So the point I was trying to make was that we in this country have got some harsh ideas about childhood, as well as this extension. The point about history actually was the one I was trying to make, which is that there are these cycles, and I did take a section and highlight it, but your point is the one I was trying to make really, is that we have changing attitudes towards childhood, and it's always good to sort of think about where we are now in comparison to a long time ago, because it just shows you a bit more about where we're at. So yeah, but I totally agree with that. I think on paternalism, I think that's a theme that's emerging about, adults on paternalism. I agree with that, but just to be devil's advocate, to say something about this crisis in culture, so that's what you're talking about, kind of like a cultural crisis, it's beyond the economic. I do think that that is a bit dismal, and that it doesn't all run in one direction. So it hasn't just deteriorated. If you think back to when adults knew best about everything, if you want, that was when we were reminded of that, weren't we, a few months ago, when the Savile inquiry, the Savile scandal happened, and there was examples of young people just being completely ignored and not listened to, in a culture where young people had no voice and no sort of right to be heard within those the systems that they were involved in. And I think that I do agree that there is puppeteering and that we only really listen to young people when we want to listen to them. But having said that, there is something positive about young people's voice as well, and I think it's important not to overlook that. So it's not all one direction of doom and gloom. I think there's some positive things and developments listening to young people's voices as well.
Just before we go back out, there was a point from the back that sort of touched on one of the things you made in your speeches about that the age of adulthood simply changing.
Extending, yeah. I think that undoubtedly those patterns are happening. All the evidence suggests that what you're talking about as an individual is happening more broadly in society, so there's loads of data about that. Explaining why that is more difficult, and we've heard some of the different explanations, haven't we, like a cultural crisis or paternalism, and then, I would draw more on some of the economic problems or the economic differences. And I know Claire said that, it's not all about economics. We didn't have a lot of money before. We didn't have a lot of money before, but it was shared out a lot more equally. So actually, things aren't the same now as they were, and we are in a really different economic context. And I would draw on that, but I know that other people wouldn't necessarily. But yeah, I do think it has been extended.
Okay, we'll start with this gentleman right at the back.
Okay, on the point that has just been made about the age of adulthood, and another point on the rubbish politics of the older generation. I was talking to somebody else a while ago, and he'd organised a discussion around the theme of the lowering of the age of suffrage in this country. And I said, why are you discussing that? It will never catch on here. Okay, I know examples of it. Well, for instance, in Nicaragua, 30 years ago, the age of ability to vote was lowered from 18 to 16. And okay, well, I can maybe think of one or two other examples from Latin America a long time ago, but not at this moment in time. Now, I don't think that that was negative at all, because what happened in Nicaragua in the 1980s was there was a very, very well organised election, which the Revolutionary Party, the Sandinistas, won very, very impressively. But two non-Sandinista established parties took part as well, the Liberals and the Conservatives, one of which was bribed by the United States not to participate and did not participate, but the other of which saw the youth of the party overthrow a decision from the party leadership to boycott the election and participate. They did participate with some results. Now, why this has come up is because my friend said to me, the proposal to lower the age of participation in the upcoming Scottish referendum to 16 is well underway, and if, or rather when that happens, it cannot fail to have an impact on the politics of the rest of the United Kingdom, even if Scotland breaks away. It seems to me that this is a very, very serious issue from the point of view of the politicisation of young people, from the point of view of the role of teachers, which in revolutionary societies had been very, very significant, and I suppose from the point of view of education institutions themselves, in which if the 16 to 18 sector is politicised, there is no way that the 14s, 15s or below will be immune to that same process once it is in school. That's my point.
Thanks. We'll go over here on the right.
No, I just spotted something perhaps that, Claire, when you were talking about the idea of wanting, almost feeling like you wanted the younger generation of people to kind of to become more political and where the older generations have perhaps become a little bit apathetic. I thought that maybe a good way of doing that would be to ask them what they thought about things from a young age in a way that they're being asked to do with these kind of school consultancies. It seems odd that maybe a way to get them thinking at a young age about the way their schools run or their class might be a great way to make them more political in the future.
Okay, thanks. And then just the...
Yeah. Okay, a couple of things that are admittedly totally anecdotal, but hopefully might illustrate a couple of things. So, for instance, the point that Claire's making about teaching in schools and kind of involving young people. I'm a medical student, and one of the big fads in medicine is peer teaching and kind of group-based, problem-based learning and that kind of thing. And when you're in a situation where you have 250, 300 years of medical knowledge, and we're in a situation where a bunch of 18-year-olds sitting around in a group can somehow do that better than, consultants teaching traditionally, does seem a little bit concerning to me. The second thing is in terms of adults themselves. I think quite a lot of my contemporaries are people in the kind of mid-late 20s. You see, there is a tendency towards, whether you call it nostalgic, kind of cookie baking, keep calm, carry on, everyone dressing up in 1950s style clothing. It's a kind of a bit of a weird retreat towards, like just in terms of people's cultural consumption, a slightly weird retreat away from being out in the labour market, for instance, and almost to the point where people, this kind of might sound a bit accusatory or something, but almost people having children is now a way to take maternity leave, get out of the labour market. This kind of sounds a bit mad, as if I'm accusing everyone who has a kid of doing this, but there is that tendency amongst some contemporaries of mine, as opposed to it being the last step of becoming a grown-up, it's now taking the opposite kind of form. So I don't know, it's totally anecdotal, a big garden, but if anyone has anything to say about that.
Sorry, I didn't see those.
Thank you. Okay, just a couple of points. I like what Claire was saying. I was reminded by watching an old edition of Tomorrow's World from 1950-something, and I was immediately struck being of a generation where everything is soundbite and quite quick bits of information, and they were talking about data comes in the future, i.e. the embryonic internet. And the article lasted for about half an hour of some serious detail, and this was a popular BBC One programme. I was immediately struck at the level of detail that used to be given to us back then, and so that first point kind of reminded me of that. Second point, very quickly, was I got a tweet from some lecturer that I follow, and it was talking about one of her the student representative came up to her and said, "We pay lots of money for our course now, therefore we should have the same. We want it to be made simpler." And she was like, "Thank you very much, but no, it's that same point that everyone's raising. They've got a lot of knowledge and they want to give it to the kids, and isn't that the problem? Isn't that whole process kind of infantilizing the kids? Like, asking them for their opinion, they're generally going to go for the easy option, and they don't have to fight for anything. Back in the day, we had to fight for stuff. No one came to us to ask us for our opinion. We had to kind of get in their faces and say, we want this."
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll just take one more here, then we'll come in, and then we still got time to go account.
Following on from the point about women dropping out to have children, I heard a gentleman on Radio 4 a few months ago who was president of a Labour Party meeting in the early 50s where they decided to change the demographic they're going to go for. Up to that point, they wanted to support the family, the woman and the man in traditional roles, and the working man is these traditional roles, for which you would require the status of what working man used to have. But they decided that there were an awful lot of educated people around, and they really had to go for men and women separately as educated people. This is where they get their votes from. But if they didn't do that, they thought they would lose. So there was a point, and I know that the Tory party followed on later as those two, unless they've got theories like Mrs. Thatcher. That was the point at which the traditional roles were lost to the politicians. And that brings us to the situation we are at now, where particularly less able boys are really thought of as being a bit pointless.
Thanks. So I'll come back in and get points. We've still got time to go out to get someone else to answer. So I'll start with you first, Tom.
I do not think that lowering the voting age to 16 will politicise anyone. And I think that, in a way, these are technical mechanisms, including the kind of consultations, that, you know, it's this idea that you can, you know, if we can get the kids involved, they'll get politicised. But, I mean, I now don't even know what that means. I've now got to the point where in this conversation it becomes a kind of meaningless thing. I mean, you know, I've been invited to speak at quite a lot of very lively, passionate political debates at universities with 400 or 500 people at them over the last few years on civil liberties. They were organised by the Islamic societies, and you know, that was a bit nerve-wracking. Do you know what I mean? What do we want on the politicisation front, right? I mean, I went and spoke there because I believed in going and having an argument with them about the madness of Sharia law and arguing in defence of Western civilization and Enlightenment values. But nonetheless, all I'm saying is that, you know, there are, you have to define our terms. And for me, just giving somebody a vote or asking them what they think about something isn't sufficient. So the way that politicisation occurs with generationally is that young people have to kick against the pricks, as it were, right? They have to basically say, I take this body of knowledge that you're trying to transmit to me, all of these ideas, all of these books, and I'm going to take some of them, reject them, argue with them, and all the rest of it. The problem we've now got is that all the 16-year-olds say to the older generation, I'm going to take your body of knowledge that you haven't bothered handing down to me, and I'm going to really argue with you. And the people they say that to say, oh, you're so right, everything we've previously thought was so awful and rubbish. And yes, and we like hip-hop too. Oh, rap music. I mean, it's like mortifyingly humiliating. And so there's nothing creative happening there. That's not the same as kind of having an argument about whether, you know, you think that, you know, Gramsci's right, or whether you kind of, you know, Ayn Rand, or whoever it is, right, that you've read it all, that you're rowing all the time. That is not the atmosphere of the average Vote 16 campaign in Scotland, where what they're arguing is, oh, well, maybe we can enthuse the 16-year-olds to vote, because not anyone else is that enthusiastic. And it's a kind of cheap shot, right? And it's unlikely it's likely to kill off. I just want to pick up on the one point that Kate made about Savile, because I felt quite uncomfortable. I mean, this has been said to me quite a lot recently, so I'm beginning to notice a trend, which is that there is a tendency to say that if you argue in defence of the authority of knowing more, and that you actually argue for a differentiation between adulthood and young people, that you are going to want to go back to the bad old days when we were all secretly raping children behind the back doors, and that people were, you know, children were, you know, not allowed to ever speak, and that you'd be kind of like ruling with a rod of iron. And I know you weren't saying that, Kate, but that is what's happened. Is we have demonised the idea of adulthood as being problematic, and we sort of almost like young people as kind of like somehow innocent, and we kind of, and that's what I meant about the deauthorising of adulthood. And I'm very nervous about that, because I don't think we're going to do young people any favours if we go along with that. But anyway, those bad old days that produced Savile also produced important ideas around liberation, freedom, you know, you want politics, women's liberation, reproductive rights, fighting racism, yeah, bloody, right? It wasn't like all sort of like sexual perverts right over here. Because at the moment we're in danger that the Jimmy Savile campaign is being dominating our view of what the immediate past was. And let me tell you, I would rather have the gains of that period, even with Jimmy Savile, than to say I'd rather not have had any of that because we've had Jimmy Savile. And because I know that the nerve-wracking nature of child abuse means that if you say that, you immediately get accused of being a paedophile apologist. I know it's difficult to say, but let me tell you something. Young people were far better served by adults who held their nerve in face of them, even if there are things like Jimmy Savile happened. Well, it might still happen today, it's neither here nor there. Right? That's the cost of freedom. That's the price you pay. Bad things happen. Bad, evil men exist. But a free society is worth having, and not everything that happened in the past is awful. A lot of it was good.
Oh, thanks, Beth. Kate, I'll just go to you next.
Okay, I'll stick with that, shall I, and then go to another point. Yeah, what I guess what you're saying is something about some amount of authoritarianism is all right, you know, and then people kick up against it. I don't know what I think about that really. I think when young people, particularly marginalised young people, come off badly from that, I think, and I don't think that was just a man doing dreadful things. There was something broader going on. I think actually, you know, it wasn't that everything was bad in the past necessarily, because I think it still happens now. You've got situations like Rochdale where young people are told that they're working in prostitution because they weren't playing the game and they weren't behaving. But we've got a Prime Minister who says that everyone who's young and sells sex is a victim. So I think there's a lot of complexity in whether young people should have a voice and how authoritarian we should be, and that some young people can come off badly in that. And then I think the other points, to come back to tomorrow's world and the labour market, I think those points are sort of connected, because there has been a shift about how we see success, maybe. And I think when we're talking about, what do young people want, what is the adulthood they're growing into, it's not necessarily learning things, watching Tomorrow's World, you know, finding out about stuff, challenging things. It is about, can I afford a house? Have I got a car? Have I got a nice job? Do I have to go to work a lot? You know, and I think there's something about consumption that I think has been touched on, and that relates to that idea of cultural consumption in Tomorrow's World, where as long as people are consuming, they're not going to necessarily tackle some of the problems that are underpinning some of the issues that they face, and maybe that is a way of tying those things together. Maybe that's why people don't want to go to work anymore, because their jobs, I don't know, that maybe they don't mean the same things. So yeah.
So, thanks, Kate. Well,
I just have a quick comment in defence of listening to young people in the education system and universities. I think if so many young people are saying that traditional sort of lecturing formats and the dissemination of information that way don't work, then there's got to be something in that. And I think there are some really good things that have come out of listening to students' sort of feedback on teaching styles. And you know, in the department that I work in, there's a real emphasis on inquiry-based learning, for example, which is about learning through doing. And actually that promotes students' independence and students going out and sort of trying things and learning through doing. And that agenda, I think, has come out of and is supported by engaging with students and talking to students about what they want from university. So for me, that's a positive thing, which wouldn't necessarily have occurred in the same way if we weren't, you know, taking account of what the students that are sort of coming to university actually want.
yeah, thanks, Will. So we're only hands. Yeah, so at the front there.
I think like what the three of you touched on, or maybe not so directly, is this kind of idea of like the culture of me, or the culture itself, especially to do with Cato or Rowley or whatever. And then was it, you know, there's this term in like the 70s, it was all to do with myself, and also, you know, like letting free my inner child and all that type of kind of therapeutic crap. And with that came kind of like this idea that the future only held maybe nothing or only something for my own self-fulfillment or self-experience, which is I think what Claire was touching on about kind of the education and about what needs to be passed on. It's this idea that the future holds no prospects, or that this changing kind of the forward march of history to do with more traditional politics is being lost, and now that we only live this moment in time and myself as I am and for my own self-fulfillment is like I think the actual problem here.
Thanks. Are there any other? Yes, yourself.
So there are 2 points I wanted to address. The first one is regarding, say that there's if you go into a young offenders institution or an HMP, more really, I mean, seeing we have such a recidivism problem in the UK, a young offenders institution is the place where you want to find out what's caused someone to fly off the roads. And you talk to the people there, you find out that many of them feel disenfranchised. They feel like they don't have any influence, they don't really have a stake in the society around them. And so I think this maybe led to some initiatives in trying to engage with these people who are going to cause a massive problem in fiscal terms, if you really want to go and judge things like that to justify them to the current government, but also for themselves and for their families. There's a massive reduction in life quality. So what's causing it? If you want to engage them more fully and try and get some idea of what's going on, maybe you need to start giving them some influence, or at least an appearance of influence. And so you could imagine this being a good story for motivating having a bit more control apportioned to the youth. But it sounds like there's been, and of course the teaching methods example I think is another good one. Not everybody can learn by rote, although the Chinese do it much, much better than the Europeans do, getting much better academic results. I don't think they're nearly as happy as European youth are. And it sounds like there's been massive function creep as a result. So we have this kind of balance between how do we stop the youth who've exhibited deviant behaviour from feeling so disenfranchised, while also retaining some kind of rational, maybe and avoiding a loss of authority from the adults. But how do we strike that balance? And the second point I'd like to ask is there was a comment in the opening statement saying that maybe it was a bit silly for the university to say that we need to address stress in students and maybe we should grow up. But isn't it fair to say that stress in any part of society should be reduced? If people feel stressed, that's a bit of a problem. And I know there's a strong argument where one might say that feeling stress means, being exposed to a bit of stress means you can take more of it. But I think that's a terrible justification for exposing people to stress if it's even avoidable at all. So I don't know if that's infantilization or not. If it is infantilization such a bad thing? And we're doing it even through, implicitly, not only through the age of voting, but the high age in the UK of alcohol use, of nicotine use, maybe even with the age of consent. And we all know that teenagers are going to do what they want to do. I mean, kids are going to go and get a bottle of white lightning at age 13 and drink it behind the bike sheds. Teenagers are going to go and have sex. And if they don't have some kind of engagement from the adults, then they're going to be doing it on their own. Isn't that a more dangerous and harmful scenario than if we give them a bit more control? And so the overall thing that I propose is maybe letting people find out a lot more things for themselves. Removing these kind of barriers, this firm demarcation between adulthood and childhood, and instead just providing a good bit of support for everybody.
It seems like this gentleman wants to come back directly to that, and then I'll go and take the other ones, just so we can get
Thank you. The one word you used there, which was quite like appropriate, was this idea of being happy. And actually, like, who's happy in China? Are they less happy or not than the people in Europe? That's actually part of the problem. Now, I think, like part of what Claire was saying is like, you're always asking these children, what will make you happy? And I'd go against it. I think that's like a huge problem in the sociology department as well, is that the department's always asking the students, what would make you happy? Well, fuck what would make you happy? I came here because I wanted people to tell me I was right or I was wrong. If that makes me happy or not, or stressed or not, that's, that is my own individual problem to deal with. It should be less about what makes us happy and more about kind of, I'm not sure what's progressive or what's like better for society, not so much about what makes me happy or less stressed. I think that's a huge problem in the education system.
and the education system is short. But I mean, I think in general, if you're unhappy, it's not nearly so productive for everybody, for society to turn around and say, fuck you, that's your own problem. And it's something maybe we need to consider and need to have some dialogue with.
And then there was that gentleman there.
All right, yeah, a couple of points. One is, I don't think has been mentioned, is that as a working class in particular, we've been robbed of whatever we had in a way of a collective response to the problems of society. In particular, the Labour Party abandoned its reform programme, whatever, such as it was, many years ago. And the trade unions have proved themselves equally useless in response to the present crisis and defending workers' interests. So working class people don't have a voice, despite all the consultations and so forth, which are, of course, devoid of meaningful content. So I think that needs to be borne in mind. The other thing is a point on the welfare state. Came into existence in a particular period, at the beginnings of the post-war boom, where it was a necessary part of the post-war consensus, a safety net for people falling out of work. It's morphed into something a bit bigger than that. It's more of a mechanism of control than a safety net, but it is still vital to the daily needs of millions of people. So I'm very wary of getting into the territory where I say we're against this. It's certainly not a model for a future society. But until we've got an alternative, I think we should defend the welfare state and not countenance any attacks on it.
Thanks. And then there was the gentleman there and then the gentleman behind you.
Just a quick question for the panel on something that's not been mentioned so far. How do you think that the changing face of access to information has impacted this infantilisation of youth? In terms of, to give an example, I was recently talking to a 14-year-old at a festival, and we got onto the topic of what we might do with our lives, and I asked her about it, and she said that she wanted to be an LGBT board game designer. Now, whether that's a realistic way to support yourself or not, I don't think many 14-year-olds put forward very realistic ways of supporting themselves. What struck me was the specificity of things. So I sort of probed that, and well, she'd been reading particular blogs for about 3 years, so that's since the age of about 11, about LGBT issues and the tradition of using things like role-playing books and so on early on for identification. All of that, so she knew all these things, which even when I was 14, I would never had access to those. If your hobby was railroads, you could get a railroad magazine, or radios, you might get a radio magazine. There was no LGBT board games magazine. And if I wanted to learn about that sort of thing, you know, I'd have to maybe talk to a relative or a friend who knew something about that, or maybe there'd be a local society or club or something. But now more and more, from a younger age, people can get quite specifically into niches, which has two sorts of effects, one of which might be that, well, you're talking about people aren't being young and careless, Claire was mentioning, and we're all rather boring and going straight into our jobs and not sort of meandering about. I think perhaps some of it is that we have better information and perhaps are able to determine from a bit earlier on what we want. But the flip side of that, of course, is that there's this huge, massive information. And you say, oh, what job do I want? You know, I thought, maybe I'll go into the social services, but maybe I'll be a Web 2.0 social media expositor for a communications syndicate company. So I think that might also factor into how a lot of people in their early 20s are meandering a bit because we're almost spoiled for choice. I was just wondering what the panel thought in terms of how that plays into what we've been discussing in the infantilisation of young people.
And thanks. And then at the very back.
Yeah, some time ago, this young chap at the side of me, he almost seemed in despair. He said he's 22 years old. I mean, I'm not being disrespectful to him, I understand where you're coming from. But he's almost saying to everybody in the room, look, I'm 22, where should I be in life Should I be at home with my mum? Should I be out fighting on the streets? What really should I be doing? And apart from Claire and some quite general comments, and she's probably not been quite harsh enough. I mean, I think she's been great in being the granny on the panel, giving people some home truths and experience of life, which is great.
Thank you for that.
But I'm not being disrespectful, I'm older than you, Claire, so... but I think the other two guys, Kate and Will, I think with what you've been saying, all you do is you further entrench the problems that this young guy's got. Almost like you have too much sympathy for him or try to understand his problems too much. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to try and be a little bit hard to be helpful. I'm going to put my granddad's head on, if you like. And I know it's awful when you get older that you say that, oh, you know, it's the old man giving me the old bull again, you know, we didn't talk like that when we were younger. But I think we really do, as adults, need to say, as experienced adults, and say to young people, look, and Claire touched on it, forget about the fallbacks in life, forget about the welfare state. I brought my kids up, and I'm going to help bring my grandkids up by saying, look, the vast majority of us, whether you used to work down the pit, you're a solicitor or whatever, you come into this life with your ability to work. And without that and earning money, you've got nothing. Don't rely on the welfare state. It's on your own back. There's two sides to it in life. Individually, you look to find your own way in life. Earn money, get on with it. Secondly, the big thing is politics. Change the world that you live in. And that's really what people should be saying to this young man here. Look, you've got a big future. There's a big world out there. Go and grab it. Grab it individually by getting off your backside, out of your mum and dad's home. Go and grab the world. Go and get it. And if you think you can't find the answer individually, get involved in politics and change the world. Don't wait for the welfare state and people to enable you and encourage you to wait for other people to come along and help you. It's a hard world out there, but together, sometimes individually, but together, we could make it a much, much better world. It ain't going to be given to us. We have to fight for it.
Great.
And I'll let Ms. John.
Yeah, since I was mentioned in that talk, I thought I might well respond to an extent. One thing talking about social media is there's a little picture of a generic person my age who's from the 80s, sort of 70s. And above it, it just says, it's got a little picture, so it'll say something that, advice that worked for him, and then why it doesn't work for our generation. And there's picture after picture after picture after picture. So this implication that I'm not going out and hard working for it, surprise, surprise, I am. Surprise, surprise, it's not gifted to me, I know. But it was, not that it was gifted to you, however, it was easier for you. And this idea that the next generation can have it easier and easier is something that hasn't happened to mine. So that's a little point I want to make about that. Going out, grabbing it, that kind of stuff, working hard for it. I'd love to, if you give me a job, anyone. And by anyone, any job, I do mean anyone and any job. I'm quite surprised that, to put it bluntly, one of my friends turned down a job. I was fascinated. I said, why? It was something that she wanted to do. I said, but why did you turn down the job? It was £2 an hour. And I thought, you know what, okay, I'll give you that one. But I'm accepting jobs that aren't paid at the moment. Someone in a job interview asked, what are you being paid? I just thought it was going to be minimum wage. I didn't even think about it. That wasn't a question that was on my vocabulary, even though I'm qualified, blah, blah, blah. I'm still sort of pleasantly surprised when I get phoned up again. And then when I'm getting a job that it's 1 month long or 3 months long, there's a little trial period, not a proper job, not a serious job. You've not done that yet, it's just a trial. So get up, go grab it, that kind of stuff. I am doing it, surprise, surprise. Not everything is in my control, and those things that aren't in my control aren't in my favour. So I'm sorry for not being the model citizen I should be.
Yes,
it seems that there seems to be a lot of blame being laid on the young people here, sort of that, you know, these people are lazy, they don't want to go out and get their jobs, you know, they're getting offered jobs and they're not taking them, blah, blah, blah. But I think it more lies that we're taught from a very young age, you can be what you want, you can go for this career, you're taught what career you want to go for. You know, you do certain subjects at school, you do a certain degree, and that will lead you into a certain career. So it's when young people are being taught this from a very young age, so we're thinking we are going into life set out that is planned, but then when we hit life, we don't actually hit the plan. So we're not exactly just going to sort of accept it. You know, there's no surprise that young people are surprised when they're not getting the job they were told their entire life they were going for. So I think we need to sort of examine, why is it young people being taught this from a young age? Why is it that the adults that are meant to be so sort of, Claire was saying, young people should be listening to adults, they should be doing what adults are saying. So young people have been listening to adults, young people have been thinking, I will go and I will be a doctor, I will do this, I will do that. They don't think I'm going to go and work in Poundland. So I think it should be examined maybe that it's not the young people, it's not their ideas, it's the ideas they're being taught from a very young age.
We also are in a massive recession,
yeah,
with a huge gap between rich and poor, with massive unemployment and underemployment. And in Sheffield, if your only qualification is a degree, then your choices are maybe go and work for the council, but you'll be up against it. Maybe go and work in healthcare, you'll need a bloody good medical or scientific degree, or go and work in research. And if you don't want to do one of those three, then your only choices in Sheffield are underemployment, unemployment, or leaving. And that's the situation.
I'm sorry, but you're reinforcing again that this economic situation is special. It's absolute and utter nonsense. It's not. The economic situation we're in today is not special. It's not more difficult. Look, when I left school, at 16, I went to work in the hospital. I'm going back into the early 70s, right? Very early 70s. It wasn't easy then. There wasn't full employment, especially for working class people then. There really wasn't. I went and earned £11 a month for 3 years. I had to get off my backside. And yes, a lot of people want to do it today, but it's no good you keep reinforcing this thing that it's like you've got this big board on your back saying, woe is me, the end is now, we can't do anything, it's harder than it's ever been before. It's absolute tosh.
No, I'm sorry, you're wrong.
You are wrong in a sense, because in our day, we could go for a job and we could get a part-time degree.
Respond to some of these questions and spin it into some concluding remarks. So I'll go in the
Can I
order.
just make one point before we go on to...
Very quickly.
You know, what I'm interested in really is the infantilisation of adults. I mean, look at Mervyn King and his grey gap year and all the CEOs that are busy now wanting to be 18 again. I mean, that we've got... Something's going very, very weird.
Sorry, we're going to go into these concluding remarks now. So, as I said, the order in which is quite Kate.
Okay, just quickly.
Yeah, so but answer a couple of points and spin that into a bit of a conclusion.
All right. The access to information, just to pick up on that. I think you talked about the opportunities and the risks, and I think that's how I see it. It creates lots of opportunities, but I'm not sure how far it also is quite a superficial engagement with a lot of the information that's out there and that's controlled actually, you know, and is sort of filtered access. So I think that sort of going back to that. The things that's going on with the young people and what they're told to be, I think that's only the fast track. I don't think that's the majority experience. I think that most young people aren't really told that they're going to go to university and that they're going to get a job. So I think it's an important experience that you're talking about, but I think that there's a preoccupation with that in policy, but I don't think that that will address the broader issues that are going on. And then I think the big point is about, I've got too much sympathy and we're sort of pandering, I've got to talk about that. I think I can live with the idea that some people might think that I've got too much sympathy for things. I can see that would be a criticism that people would suggest, but I think maybe what I would respond by saying is that you're saying sort of dependency is really bad, you've got to do it all yourself, and I don't think dependency is that bad. I think that if we thought dependency was all right, we might depend on the state a bit more, depend on each other, depend on people that we live near. What's wrong with that? That's actually a form of collectivism that actually quite excites me. So yeah, I do think, I don't mind if you think that I've got too much sympathy for people, and because I think that there is a route through that into addressing the sort of culture of oneness and the self. I think there's a way to address that culture of the self by saying, well, what do you want to stake in, and let's try and give you that. You know, I don't think
Thank you. So,
responding first of all to the sort of comment about the information, access to information on the internet again, I think young people's propensity to access career-specific information is likely to be, or is always going to be dependent on, their broader understandings and aspirations. So for the young people that I've worked with, all that information on the internet is there, but they're not looking at it. Which I think takes you back to the issue of sort of structural inequality, in some respects, the economic situation again, and this sort of, occupational apathy that young people are facing, feeling like they don't have prospects and they don't have the ability to sort of reach these stages in the life course, perhaps. But I would agree with the gentleman in the back there in terms of saying that, perhaps if the opportunities aren't there, then what we need to do is be politicising people, perhaps trying to, take back the Labour Party, and and I think youth work education is a good sort of platform to communicate those sorts of ideas. But doing it's very challenging, and it's always linked to funding agendas and the sort of capacity that gives you to do those sorts of workshops and to communicate in that sort of way. So for me, it's difficult to move away from the economic sort of context here, actually.
Okay, thanks, Will. And finally, Claire.
Authority is not the same as authoritarianism, and you can't have adulthood unless you believe in authority and in being authoritative. And that was what I was trying to say. These things, it's, to sort of say, some people believe in authoritarianism, misunderstands. But I do believe in authority and adults having a distinct phase of their life from children and young people and adolescents. However, I thought you made an excellent point about if you were to ask me what date it is that people go from being an adolescent to an adult, I couldn't tell you, and to a certain extent that's what the rites of passage thing has tried to do historically, even from pre-modern societies, to try and kind of identify certain periods, at this stage you grow up, or it's kind of certain things. You get your driving test, obviously not in pre-modern society. You get whatever it is, right? You're allowed to, you get your what's it called? You milk round, or paper round. You get your first job, you get your first Saturday job. There's all these sort of like bits of things. And the thing is, we've lost that. We don't really know. One of the great rites of passage places that happened with adults and young people together was the pub. And what used to happen in the pub was that basically you're not allowed to drink in a pub unless you're 18. I don't, I'm obviously not just telling you, not just because I want to drink. But anyway, you're not allowed to drink until you're 18. And every adult in the pub would know that there was a bunch of 16, 17-year-old scallies in the corner, having a drink, right? And and they'd kind of go up, pretend that they were 18 and think they got away with it, as though everybody hadn't thought, no, you look like 13, what are you kidding me, right? Like, so the adults knew it's a conspiracy, right? But the conspiracy was a kind of mutual intergenerational knowledge that at some point you have to kind of go from being the scally who's kind of sneaking in the odd pint, who's going to get drunk, who's, then he gets his 17 kind of vomits every another round, and then get through, and eventually he'll grow up, she will grow up, not to just say it's men, if you see me in the pub, and basically that you have this transition. Now, pubs are kind of being evicted of anyone, first of all, anyone who gets drunk, never mind children who get drunk. Grown-ups who choose to get drunk are treated like children, and as a consequence these intergenerational transactions don't happen, but 14-year-olds still drink, but they're drinking in the parks away from any adult supervision. So that is a problem of certain things. And then I suppose student feedback, please don't think that student feedback works. It is, if every student in the university says that they know who the best lecturer is, they are wrong, right? I mean, that is, why would you ask them, the least educated people, especially on teaching styles? What we've now got is we've got all these kind of slick, PowerPointed lecturers, kind of really entertaining and popular, but know nothing. Caricature, of course. But I mean, you certainly don't ask the students that. That is Philistinism. That's what I was saying about when we've given up the ghost in academia. And the thing that I wanted to finish on was this weird thing that in primary schools, I think Kate made a really, really important point about one of the real horrible things in this country, which is about age of criminal responsibility at 10. It's a disgrace, right? There's no way 10-year-olds are criminally responsible, in my opinion. Talk about a rite of passage an age confusion. But there were thousands of young primary school pupils arrested last year and who now have criminal records for racism, homophobia and sexual harassment. Now, talk about a confusion in society, right? Basically, the childish cruelties of, calling people names or running after the girls and pulling their knickers down or whatever, and now get you on a sexual offences register, right? The irony about saying to children, you can decide who's the head teacher, you can go on the governing body when you're in primary school, of confusing childhood and adulthood, is that you actually destroy innocence and the irresponsibility of being young. Because the great thing about being young is, in a way, that you're protected by someone who kind of lets you make mistakes and you experiment, but there's a kind of loving, caring person. Anyway, what then happens is you grow up and you have to go it alone. And for those people who have talked about the loving, caring sort of state as being the substitute for the child, then basically that does mean that you are a child forever. And that the daddy, mummy state looks after you. And that daddy, mummy state is the controlling power in society. And that basically means that you are not free. And in that case, China's the place for you. Because you really want to be looked after, go to an authoritarian regime with a state that says, don't you worry about a thing. We will take care of everything for you. I don't want to live there.
I think you could choose China's king.
And indeed.
Can we thank our speakers, please?